This first video will cover the endocrine system in general. I'm going to use the PowerPoint that I typically use with my classes here, and then I will go through the study guides and specific information within those, and then material that's in your textbook as well. So within my PowerPoint for the endocrine system, we have the different objectives that I want my students to know. So I'm just going to read through those and talk about them a little bit. So we'll go over what is the reason for having an endocrine system, how is it tied into the nervous system, what kinds of things are controlled by the endocrine system, what does an endocrine gland do, how is it different than an exocrine gland, the different chemical natures of hormones, and then some of this material I will skip over because it doesn't look like that it was covered as much in your textbook and your study guides as what I do in my classes. We'll talk about hormone release regulation, and again some other material that I'll probably skip through. And then we'll look at the structural and functional relationship with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We'll look at adenohypophysis hormones. We'll look at the neurohypophysis, thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, adrenal gland, pancreas, and then we'll hit on some other tissues that are endocrine in nature but yet are not considered true endocrine glands. So if we take a look at this picture, we can see where the major endocrine glands are in the body. We have the hypothalamus up here in the brain. Then the pituitary that hangs down from the hypothalamus, and then back here in the epithalamus we have the pineal gland. We come down here into the throat and we have the thyroid gland, and on the posterior aspect or the dorsal aspect of the thyroid gland we will find 4 to 6 to 8 parathyroid glands. We have the thymus, the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidney, the pancreas, and then the ovaries and the testes. So the purpose of the endocrine system is to maintain homeostasis. And as the body comes out of homeostasis for whatever reason, there are two ways that, one, we detect that we're out of homeostasis, and then two, how do we reestablish that? So the first one obviously is the nervous system. It's going to immediately detect and respond to changes in our environment, whether it's our internal environment or our external environment, and adjust those changes or adjust our behavior or cellular function or something in response to that in a very acute manner. You know that our nervous system is going to function quite rapidly, whereas our endocrine system is also, its purpose is also to be able to respond and restore homeostasis, but in a much slower manner and in a mechanism that's very different than what we see with the nervous system. So remember then with the endocrine system that we use hormones instead of neurotransmitters that will go into the bloodstream and then, like it says, coordinate and integrate the activity of the body cells. And it's the second great control system of the body because it's a little slower acting, more chronic in its nature in maintaining homeostasis. So it's important though that the endocrine system and the nervous system work together to maintain homeostasis. So we know that the nervous system is only going to affect muscles or glands. So as the neurotransmitters go out to the body, they will only affect those structures. The targets of the nervous system, again, are going to respond in milliseconds, resulting in a very rapid response and a very short-term response, as well as those neurotransmitters their effects are terminated either by the reuptake by the presynaptic neurons or mopping up out of diffusion away from the synapse and mopping up by the astrocytes, or degradation like what we see with acetylcholine with the enzyme on the postsynaptic membrane, like acetylcholinesterase that breaks down the acetylcholine. Okay, so we got that. So that's this third bullet, that the stimulus is short-lived. Okay, so the endocrine system then is going to influence its target tissues, so here are some cells, for example, bone cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts. Those are acted on by hormones. The cells within the testes and ovaries are acted on by hormones that are not going to be acted on by neurotransmitters. And so we have a greater variety of things that we can affect using the endocrine system. And so hormones, of course, will be released from the endocrine glands or the other endocrine tissues, and then the hormones will travel through the bloodstream, and they'll go right into a capillary bed, and that's what makes an endocrine gland an endocrine gland, is that there are no ducts, that the material just will be released through exocytosis or other means by which the neurotransmitter is released into the bloodstream. Okay, so since the hormones have to travel through the bloodstream, obviously the response time is going to be much longer. While it seems very, very quickly when you think about I slammed on my brakes and now my heart is beating very rapidly, that's both a neural and an endocrine response. So you have that initial norepinephrine being released when you see the stress, you see the threat, and then you slam on your brakes, but you need to maintain that sympathetic stimulation. And so norepinephrine has gone to the adrenal medulla and has stimulated the release of additional norepinephrine and epinephrine now into the bloodstream to keep that sympathetic stimulation going until you have survived that acute stress. And that's very, very rapid. Although thyroxine, for example, is going to take a really long time to go out into the bloodstream and stay in the bloodstream and then be removed from the bloodstream. So it depends on the nature of the hormone, how long the response is, how quick the response is, and like I put there, that the responses are slower. The lag period may be seconds, or it may even be days before the stimulus has been applied and then the hormone being released. And then because hormones are going to last longer in the blood because of their half-time or half-life, the response of the target tissues is typically more prolonged. All right, so what are some things that the endocrine system governs? So if you keep these things in mind, it may help you later on in the final exam to remember what hormones do what. So we have hormones that affect reproduction, growth and development, mobilizing body defenses against stressors. This is going to be both acute stress and chronic stress. So when we think about acute stress, we think sympathetic stimulation and the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. We think about chronic stress, then we think of the release of the mineral corticoids and the glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex, like aldosterone and cortisol. And so that's going to be longer term stress than the acute stress that we get, necessitating the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then very, very important, remember that we have an internal environment that we need to maintain, and so our hormones are going to help us, our endocrine system is going to help us maintain that environment. And so we have electrolytes, fluids, and nutrient balance in the blood is maintained, and then cellular metabolism and energy balance. So those are the things they're really not anything that we see the endocrine system doing won't fall out of those 5 groups, won't be outside of those 5 groups. So here's just the difference between exocrine and endocrine. Again, exocrine has ducts, endocrine does not. They have capillary beds. So they have a rich vascular or lymphatic drainage that receives their products. All right, so we got 2 kinds of hormones. I lumped the epinephrine and the thyroxine in with the other proteins. So we do have the amino acid ones like the catecholamines and thyroxine, or we have the bigger ones, which are the regular proteins like vasopressin or ADH or aldosterone. No, aldosterone's a steroid hormone. Sorry about that. Growth hormone or whatever, all the other hormones. So most of the hormones are made either of amino acids or those many amino acids making up a protein. So you can see they're going to vary in size from very simple amino acid derivatives to very large proteins, extremely large proteins. Steroids, on the other hand, are lipid hormones, they are going to be made from a cholesterol precursor, and then we will build on those. So some characteristics of the steroid hormones: they're going to be lipid soluble, they're going to be nonpolar, and they're also very small compared to some of the amino acid based hormones, which are going to be polar and not be able to just slip through the cell membrane and not lipid soluble at all. And so their modes of action are going to be different, or their signaling capabilities are going to be much different. So steroid hormones then produced by the gonads. So we have testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and then adrenal cortex we have the cortisol and the aldosterone. Okay, so we can look at, well, what does a hormone do? What does it do to the target cell? Remember, it can't tell a cell to do anything it's not already programmed to do. So all it's going to do is either increase the activity of a target cell, or it's going to decrease the activity. It's going to inhibit or stimulate. And whatever those activities are depends on what the target cells are. So I get into this with my students, so I'm not really going to go over this. So you can take a look at, we can either alter the membrane permeability, we can be tropic on a hormone, which means it's going to stimulate the production of a hormone from another gland and then induce its secretory activity. We're going to activate or deactivate enzymes like we see with insulin and progesterone. Why did I even say that? Insulin and glucagon. And then stimulate mitosis like we see with growth hormone, or insulin-like growth factor, that it stimulates the production of. Okay, so let's get into a tropic hormone. So what does a tropic hormone do? So if we take a look at the hypothalamus is the king of the endocrine system. I know a lot of times we say, oh, the pituitary gland, it's the master gland, it's the one that's going to control everything. Well, sure, but it's more like the foreman. The hypothalamus is the boss, and it's the boss of the autonomic nervous system, and because the autonomic nervous system maintains homeostasis, the hypothalamus is going to be in charge of maintaining homeostasis. And it's got two options. It can use the nervous system to maintain homeostasis, or it can use the endocrine system to do that. And when it chooses to use the endocrine system, then it's going to release what we call tropic hormones. So this first one right here is thyrotropin releasing hormone. So all of the tropic hypothalamic hormones are called releasing hormones, or inhibitory, like the prolactin inhibitory hormone. And we'll talk about that later. But these are going to stimulate another gland to release its hormones. And so thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to stimulate the cells within the anterior pituitary that produce thyroid stimulating hormone. And then TSH is going to go to the thyroid gland, and it's going to stimulate the production of T3 and T4 thyroid hormones, or thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And then those hormones will then go to the target cells. And because of the presence of the thyroid hormones, T3, T4, in the bloodstream, they then have a negative feedback back to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, regulating levels of TRH and TSH. So if I have enough thyroid hormone circulating through my bloodstream, I don't need to constantly be making TRH and TSH. And we'll get into that in probably, I guess it's the second study guide, the one that has to do with thyroid hormone. All right. I separate the modes of action of the hormones once they bind to their receptors. The book, your textbook, didn't separate them in general. All it did is say how each hormone did it. So I give you the big picture, and then I say, okay, here are the hormones that are going to do that. So I guess I do it backwards to how your book does it. So because the protein hormones cannot get through the cell membrane, their receptor needs to be on the cell membrane. Okay, so I'll probably put this in the announcement or somewhere so that you can click on that and take a look at that. So I'll do that later. Okay, so here's a good little video that, image to show how the second messenger system works. So here is the hormone. That's the first messenger. It's going to be tied to a receptor. that will activate G protein. So we have the G protein coupled processes. We have the tyrosine kinase processes. I don't get heavy duty into that with my students, but there's some stuff in the study guides that we'll look at. But at any rate, here's what we're going to do. We're going to bind the hormone to the receptor, which is going to activate G protein. And then the G protein is going to activate the adenylate cyclase. And then the adenylate cyclase is going to increase the intracellular levels of cyclic AMP, which is now my second messenger. And so this is then going to turn on my protein kinases and activate my cell processes through this cascade of active protein kinase. So whatever the cell is supposed to do, it will do that when we increase intracellular levels of cyclic AMP. So that's what this says right there. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger. The hormone then is going to be the first messenger. There's a second way that we can do that, and so you can read through that, but I'm just going to go ahead and take a look at the picture. So here the hormone binds. Again, we're activating G protein, but now instead we're going to use diacylglycerol or my phospholipase, and we're going to convert this PIP2 into IP3, which is then going to go to the smooth ER, and it's going to stimulate the release of calcium. Calcium binds with calmodulin, and then we can increase the responses of the target cell. So the catecholamines, TRH, ADH, the luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone, well, GnRH, and oxytocin are all going to act in that manner. And if we go back to this one, oh, it's not on there anymore. It was in a different video or a different slide that I had. Okay, then we have intracellular receptors and nuclear receptors. And these are going to be the ones that the steroid hormones use. So here is the steroid. Because they are lipid soluble, they're going to be able to pass through the plasma membrane and bind to either an intracellular receptor or a nuclear receptor. In this picture, this just shows an cytosolic receptor. So it binds, and then the receptor hormone complex come in. They sit down on the gene and then trigger the translation or the transcription of this gene. So here now it instructed the cell to make a messenger RNA of that, which is then going to leave the nucleus, and then it will be translated and it'll create a new protein. So that's how the steroid hormones are going to work. So you can either have the receptor out here in the cytosol, or you can have the receptor in the nucleus. And I know the book doesn't separate those out entirely, because some of you asked what is the difference between an intracellular receptor and a nuclear receptor. Well, it just depends on, is one cytosolic or one found within the nucleus. So that's that. Okay, so in order for a cell to be able to be a target cell, it must contain a receptor for that particular hormone. If you don't have a receptor, that hormone is not going to affect the target cell. Now, another thing that's going to affect whether or not the target cells will do their job is if you have hormones, how many hormones you have, and how long they're going to stay there. Hormones have a half-life that your book talks about. How long does it take for half of the material to be degraded by the kidneys and the liver? The target cell also may have an immediate response to it, or maybe hours or days, depending on what is the blood level of the hormone. The duration of the reaction in the presence of the hormone may be between 20 minutes to hours long because of the half-life. So some hormones do not last very long within the bloodstream. Epinephrine is our shortest one. Thyroid hormone, T4, can actually last several days within, and then once it's not bound anymore, then it's going to take a while for either the liver or the kidney to clear that out of the bloodstream. Your book also talks about the difference between upregulation and downregulation. Upregulation is when the receptors on the target cell increase in number, so the hormone itself stimulates the production of receptors so that the cell may be more responsive to the presence of the hormone. Or we may have downregulation, which will cause the receptors to be removed from the cell membrane so that the target cells will not overreact to the presence of the hormone. We also have affinity, not going to worry about that. Okay, so how do we control hormone release? It all comes back to how does homeostasis work? Typically, homeostasis works through negative feedback mechanisms. So as we have, for example, plasma levels of the hormone rises, or when homeostasis is restored, the gland is inhibited from producing more of the hormone, can be by the hormone itself. So like I showed you how the thyroid hormone inhibits TSH and TRH production, and insulin and glucagon inhibit one another so that you're not raising and lowering blood sugar at the same time and messing everything up. Positive feedback, on the other hand, as the levels of the hormone rise, the gland is stimulated to produce more of the same hormone. Great example of that is oxytocin. Oxytocin has a positive feedback mechanism as we start to do the contraction of the uterus. As baby oxytocin is made and crosses the placenta, gets into the mommy, causes those uterine contractions, then the signal goes to the mommy brain, goes to the mommy hypothalamus, and then her hypothalamus goes, "Ooh, I guess it's time to have a baby." And so then she'll start making more oxytocin, which causes more uterine contractions, which causes more oxytocin release. And that's how labor contractions get stronger and closer together in order to have that baby. All right, now, there were a lot of, well, in your tables that you had to fill out, the first column was all about, well, what triggers the release? What is the stimulus for the release of the hormone? And we can lump all the hormonal stimuli together into 3 categories. So they can either be humoral, which means you're going to have something in your bloodstream that's going to change, like sodium levels or potassium levels or glucose levels or water levels or something. Some aspect of the bloodstream is changing and hormones are going to take care of that. So here in this case, insulin and glucagon are being stimulated for their release due to the increase or decrease, as the case may be, respectively, of blood glucose levels. Aldosterone is in response to falling plasma sodium levels and rising plasma potassium levels. Neural stimuli, not so many neural stimuli. One of the primary neural stimuli is sympathetic stimulation from the brain to from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla to stimulate, or it's come right from the hypothalamus. Comes right from the hypothalamus. Those are the presynaptic neurons, sorry. Are going to come out of there and then go to the adrenal medulla and release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Another neural stimulus, of course, is the release of oxytocin with uterine contractions, and a third neural stimulus is prolactin production due to the action of nursing a baby. And then the last one are the hormonal stimuli. So these are going to be tropic hormones, and they will in turn stimulate or inhibit glands like the action of the hypothalamus on the pituitary, the action of the pituitary on the thyroid and the gonads, on the prolactin or the lactiferous cells in the breast, the epithelial there that produces milk, is going to be a hormonal stimulus, the prolactin production from the, well, actually no, the inhibition of that would be a hormonal stimulus from the hypothalamus onto the anterior pituitary. Here's just a picture that shows the different kinds of stimuli. All right, we're not even going to go into that because your book doesn't even talk about that. Okay, so really quickly, we need to understand the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So we'll take a look at the posterior pituitary. So here is, we call it the neurohypophysis because we have neurons that originate in two nuclei within the hypothalamus called the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei. And these together are going to produce these two nuclei. Their neurons run down through the infundibulum and into the posterior pituitary, and they produce ADH, or arginine vasopressin, and oxytocin. And so when the stimulus comes to the anterior, to the hypothalamus, they're going to produce the hormones, and then we're going to store them down here in secretory vesicles, down here in the axon terminals. And then when it's time to release those hormones, then the neurons will fire, and then, like it says, the action potentials arriving at the axon terminals will cause oxytocin or ADH to be released into this capillary bed, into the bloodstream, and there they go. So that's the first relationship. So please make sure you remember there are no hormones made in the posterior pituitary. They are produced in the nuclei within the hypothalamus, and then they are simply released into the bloodstream at the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is a different matter. This is called the adenohypophysis, and the reason why we call it that is because it's the glandular part. So within the adenohypophysis, or the pars distalis, we're going to see epithelial tissue, 3 different groups of epithelial tissue, whose job it is to produce the 6 anterior pituitary hormones right here. So I always have my students memorize them really quick. I just go ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, GH, and PRL, and those are the 6 anterior pituitary hormones. We don't learn a mnemonic device. I just force them in the good old primary way. I write them on the board, and then I erase one, and then we say them all together until they have them all memorized. So that may work for you as well, but whatever works for you. So back here in the ventral hypothalamus, we have another cluster of hypothalamic neurons that are going to release the tropic hormones. So we have growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and prolactin inhibitory hormone. And so those 6 tropic hormones then are going to pass through, or going to be released from, the axon terminals that are here at the start of the infundibulum, and now we're going to go into what's called the hypophyseal portal system. So here is what it says, hypophyseal portal system. So a portal system is when you have 2 capillary beds linked by a vein. And that the products of the material that goes into the first capillary bed is not going to go out into general circulation. It's going to go down through the portal vein, go to a second capillary bed, and influence the cells in the second capillary bed. And then, in this particular case, the hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary will pass into that second capillary plexus and then on out into the rest of the body. So we have our first primary capillary plexus, the hypophyseal portal veins right here, and then the secondary capillary plexus, and then we can see the ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, GH, and PRL being released into circulation. And that's what all of this says right there. And then I think that's all that, because here just has an overview of what growth hormone does. Here's too much, too little of growth hormone. We get gigantism or dwarfism for too much or too little of it. Here's where our thyroid gland is. Here's where the parathyroid glands are. When we get into thyroid in the study guide, then I'll talk to you specifically about goiter, how you get a goiter, why you get exophthalmos when you have a hyperthyroidism. Here is PTH. This is a really good thing. Your book talks just primarily about PTH and its effect on the osteoclasts in the bone, but it's much more than that. And so we have the primary one, oops, I'm trying to get my cursor back, is an increase in osteoclast activity. So what the osteoclasts are going to do is remove the calcium phosphate from the bone, put it back into the bloodstream to increase blood calcium levels. We also can send the PTH to the proximal convoluted tubule and increase calcium reabsorption. But here's another super important: when we have the cholecalciferol that's going to be made by your skin, the vitamin D that's made by your skin needs to go to the kidney. It needs to be converted into 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3. And that is what then goes to the small intestine for calcium absorption. And without the 125 dihydroxy D3, which is hard to say, I think all the parts that are there, that then the calcium can be reabsorbed. But in its absence, like in rickets, for example, without the vitamin D, then the calcium doesn't get reabsorbed. You can have all the calcium in the world, it's not going to be reabsorbed. Okay, if we go to this next slide, shows the adrenal gland. The two parts of the adrenal gland, we have a cortex and a medulla. The medulla, the chromaffin cells within here that are going to produce the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, and then within the adrenal cortex, we have these three areas. We have the zona reticularis, fasciculata, and glomerulosa. Up here in the top, we're going to produce the aldosterone, the mineral corticoid, and then here in the next two layers, we're going to produce the cortisol and the androgens. Okay, and then like I said with what is the body's response to stress is due to the adrenal gland, and so we can have long-term stress, where we have the CRH being produced and go to the ACTH, and then we produce the cortisol in here. But at the same time, we're also going to produce aldosterone, and because maybe the electrolyte levels are messed up in our body, or our blood fluid levels, and so we have too much potassium, which is going to cause the secretion of aldosterone again from the zona glomerulosa, or we have low blood pressure, low blood volume, which is going to result in renin release, which results in the production of angiotensin II, which will then again go to the adrenal cortex and cause the secretion of aldosterone. And then we reabsorb sodium and potassium and excrete potassium, and then our blood volume and pressure go up, and now I have dealt with that chronic stress of low blood pressure. If you have too much cortisol, you have a disease called Cushing's syndrome, and we have Cushing's syndrome and Cushing's disease, and they're just different depending on, is one primary hypercortisolism, which means I got a tumor in my zona glomerulosa and my adrenal cortex, and I'm producing, glomerulosa, the reticulata or fasciculata, and I'm producing too much cortisol originally from the adrenal gland, or I could have secondary hypercortisolism because I'm producing too much ACTH from my adrenal gland. And so some characteristics, one, this picture shows we get fat deposition back here on the back. We call it a buffalo hump. Also, you're going to get fat deposited in your face. We're going to get a moon face. We're going to get abdominal trunk fat deposition, and we're going to get the fat mobilized from the arms and legs and deposited abdominally. Here just shows the difference between short-term stress, long-term stress. So short-term stress, sympathetic stimulation, here's what's going to happen with the release of the catecholamines. And then long-term stress, either the mineral corticoids or glucocorticoids, either we're going to raise blood sodium levels or we're going to raise blood glucose levels. That's really what it's all about. But here's one of the really interesting things right here is cortisol. You're probably familiar with cortisone shots or hypercortisone cream. Why do I use that when I have chronic inflammation or I have itching or something like that? Well, it's because one of the actions of cortisol is to suppress the immune system. So in the short term, that's great because sometimes, that inflammation we have too much swelling, we have too much pain. So we're going to shoot the cortisol in there and help get rid of the pain and that inflammation. But if we have excessive cortisol release, and my immune system is suppressed, now I'm going to get sick. and I'm not going to get better. And so that's why a lot of times when it gets down to finals and you've been stressing all semester long, and then you get a cold and it lasts for like 6 weeks, and you're like, why am I not getting better? Well, that's why. It's because you have too much cortisol. Okay, here are the endocrine structures within the pancreas. These are called the islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. There are actually 3 types of cells, but we're just going to worry about the 2 types of cells within the pancreatic islets. Excuse me. So the alpha cells are the glucagon producing cells. Here, the darker red ones. The beta cells are the lighter colored cells. They produce insulin, and it's the beta cells that are the target for type 1 diabetes. And as you may be familiar with, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. For whatever reason, sometimes it's a lot of previous infection trigger, but your body turns on the beta cells, like doesn't turn them on. Your immune system goes and then attacks and destroys them. So it's, you know, like a dog turns on you. Well, your immune system turns on your beta cells and causes their destruction, their complete destruction, and therefore you don't make insulin anymore. And then you have type 1 diabetes, mellitus. And then the alpha cells then are going to be the cells that help with hypoglycemia. So if you don't have enough, if your blood sugar is too low, then glucagon will be released and go to your liver, and it cause glycogenolysis, or the conversion of glycogen back into glucose. And then we have the cells of digestion. These are the acinar cells. So these are exocrine. They will go into the ducts that are out around here, around these little acini, and they will secrete their digestive enzymes, the zymogens. So we have the trypsinogen, and then it comes out and gets converted to trypsin, and then that will stimulate the conversion of the rest of the pancreatic hormones. So lipase and pancreatic amylase and chymotrypsin and carboxypeptidase activate those as they go into the duodenum. Here just shows some blood glucose regulation. So when my blood glucose level is high, my pancreas will be stimulated to secrete insulin, which will do 2 things. It'll go to our muscle cells, tissue cells primarily, not our brain, which is really important to know that there are no insulin receptors in your brain, which is really good because your brain just takes up glucose by itself and doesn't need the stimulation of the insulin to insert those glucose receptors into the cell membrane. When it goes to the liver, we want to convert glucose into glycogen for the storage of liver and the storage of glucose within the liver. And these 2 things then are going to cause blood glucose levels to fall below normal range. And let's say that it falls too low. So then the pancreas again will be stimulated because we have the little glucose receptors within the pancreas. And they will go, not enough glucose out here, so I guess I better make some glucagon, which will then go to the liver and stimulate glycogen conversion back to glucose, which in a process we call glycogenolysis. Or my favorite thing, one of my favorite body processes is gluconeogenesis. So glucagon can also stimulate the liver to take fatty acids and convert those into glucose that we then run through the Krebs cycle. But then we're going to take glucose levels back up to normal range. And so we're always teeter-tottering back and forth all day long, every day. Here are just some videos about that. Okay, thyroid hormone. I'm going to show you this now because I'm going to talk about it in the study guide, and then you'll be able to say, oh yeah, she did say that almost every cell in your body is affected by thyroxine, or T3, T4. Okay, so obviously because it's for metabolism, it's going to affect our basal metabolic rate. So it causes us to go through cellular respiration. If my caloric intake goes up, I'm going to increase basal metabolic rate. If my caloric intake goes down, I'm going to decrease my metabolic rate. And as we go through metabolism, sure, we're converting one chemical to another, and you know all the time heat's going to be released. And so as we're producing ATP, then our body temperature goes up. Okay, so that's that. Also, okay, so what do I need in order to go through cellular respiration? Well, I need a reactant. I need glucose, I need a fatty acid, or I need proteins. I need something to burn. And so thyroxine will help with that as well. Thyroxine is also vitally important in the formation of a normal nervous system in the fetus. When it doesn't happen, then we have, where's it called? Oh, they didn't put it in here. It's called cretinism, slowed and deficient brain development retardation. In an adult, we call it myxedema, or hypothyroidism, but myxedema is kind of a cool name. And then here's the hyperthyroidism. The Graves' disease is a autoimmune disease, and when the antibodies attack the thyroid gland, it's like TSH stimulation. So you're just kicking out thyroxine like crazy, and that's what causes the decrease in body temperature. Your brain just goes like 100 miles an hour, and then it causes water to accumulate. We get edema behind your eyeballs, and the fat tissue that's behind your eyeballs makes your eyeballs bulge out. Personality changes. That's like you're just wired, is what a person with Graves' disease is like. So irritability, restlessness, insomnia. Your just brain's going 100 miles an hour, and so is your body. Cardiovascular system. When thyroxine is present on the heart, it's going to have a slow but steady increase in cardiac output, and so because you come back to here and you're stimulating cellular respiration, you need to support that, and so you have to increase cardiac output too. If you need to burn more carbohydrates, you better be delivering those carbohydrates. And so that's why when we increase thyroxine, we also increase contractility of the heart, which is right there. Muscular system. Okay, we also need thyroxine for our muscular system. I'm not going to get heavy duty into these. Skeletal system, GI tract, reproductive system, and integumentary system. Okay, so what are hormones produced by organs other than major endocrine organs? Adipose produces leptin. Leptin is the thing that makes you feel full. And so as you are eating fatty foods and stimulating that lipid deposition within the adipose tissue, then your brain goes, okay, I'm fine. I don't need to eat anymore. And that's why we need to eat fat in our diet. We've seen back in the 80s when we went total, fads are nuts. Now we're on the whole low carb fad, but there was a low fat fad, 20, 30 years ago. We weren't eating anything with fat in it, and nobody was happy because we were eating all these carbs to try to get our leptin fix, and it wasn't working. Now, it would be really nice if we could get those adipose cells to produce leptin, with a pill or something, and we can't. Ghrelin, and we'd like to suppress ghrelin right here because that's what makes you want to eat. And then leptin. So we want to suppress ghrelin and we want to stimulate leptin. We can't do that yet. So there's no quick pill for not wanting to eat and then feeling full, because that's the trade-off. We don't want to eat because we feel full. Okay. Let's see. And then I won't get into that one. Well, you guys don't even need to know this. I'm just telling you. So here are all the gastrointestinal peptides, hormones, So we have gastrin, which stimulates gastric secretion. Ghrelin, which is going to tell us that we want to eat. I need to eat. Secretin is going to inhibit. Let's see. There it is. Is going to inhibit gastric secretion. And cholecystokinin, my favorite hormone of digestion, is also going to inhibit secretory activity, but they stimulate things that go on in the duodenum. They stimulate the pancreas and the liver so that we can have stuff go on in the duodenum. So the secretin that then comes out of the enteroendocrine cells of the duodenum then is going to go to the pancreas and the liver, and it's going to stimulate the release of bicarbonate-rich pancreatic juice, and not so much the bile, because that's cholecystokinin's job. And so it's going to go to the pancreas and it's going to stimulate the enzyme-rich juice. So this is going to have all the enzyme in it. This is the bicarbonate to neutralize that acidic chyme that comes into the duodenum. Stimulates the release of the bile, so it gets the contractions going on within the gallbladder, and then it opens the sphincter that goes between the common bile duct and the hepatic, well, no, not common bile duct, goes from the hepatic duct and the pancreatic duct into the duodenum. Normally that's going to be shut, but in the presence of cholecystokinin, it causes that sphincter to relax, and then bile and pancreatic juice enter the duodenum. Okay, we're not going to worry about those other ones. And then the heart produces ANP, which is antagonistic to aldosterone. So what it does is inhibits sodium release or reabsorption, and then will inhibit aldosterone secretion to lower blood pressure. Because if you have a lot of sodium in your bloodstream, your blood pressure is going to go up. Kidneys produce erythropoietin, secreted in response to hypoxia. The epithelial cells within the kidney, they go to the red bone marrow and say, hey, guess what? We're not getting enough oxygen here. Will you make more red blood cells? So EPO is the one that Olympic athletes and Lance Armstrong in the Tour de France were abusing so that they would have, an edge. And don't worry about the skeleton. Then cholecalciferol is made by the skin, but then it has to go to the kidneys to get changed into 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3, and then it will cause the absorption of calcium across the cell membranes of the small intestine. And we won't worry about the thymus either. Okay, so that's that.